Welcome. Before we get started, a couple of changes I want to point out on the course schedule. First is we're here on February 2nd, and previously, if you look on your old course schedule, you will have seen that on February 16th, your literature review, I believe, was due. And I have um, removed that and instead extended, given you an extra week. And instead of having you do the literature review do first, I'm having you do the introduction first, which was previously called the purpose statement. I just want to make things a little bit more consistent and clear because today we're going to be all about the introduction. And I want you to do that first. And I've moved the literature review down here to March 16th. So that's when you'll have that due. So for clarity's sake, I want you to go in and download a new copy of the course schedule and get on top of that. If you've already done work on your literature review, that's great. You'll have it both for your introduction and then for your literature review later. But I've gotten a couple emails from folks needing some clarification on topics related to crafting and introduction. So we're going to start there. Before we get started, one thing I want to say is that crafting a introduction is the hardest part of writing a research proposal. And the reason for that is because, and I want you guys to follow these guidelines when you're writing your own, it is about no less than 2 pages and no more than 4 pages long. A good solid introduction to a proposal is 3 pages. You get, around 2.5 and it's a little thin. Right around 3 is just right. So, and if you get into 4, 3.5 is okay. Between 2.5 and 3.5 pages is the sweet spot. If you're into 4 pages, you might be a little wordy. So between 2.5 and 3.5 pages is what you're going for. But for your purposes, I understand you may not be able to get it all right. So no less than 2, no more than 4 pages, double spaced, is what I want from your first assignment. I want no less than 2, no more than 4, double spaced, and you should include a references section as well as a title page, and everything should be in APA. And if you've taken a Milholland class, then you should know how to write APA. So the whole purpose of this lecture today is to talk about the introduction. The overview of a research proposal, obviously, is that you have an introduction, literature review, and methods, but this is where we're interested in for today, the introduction. And the introduction is crucial because it's like the first few pages of a story. It captures the audience. So let's talk about what goes into the introduction. Generally, you are going to establish the research problem. And what is the research problem? Well, you generally look at the research problem in 2 ways. First, it's a research problem is generated by your interests. What are the things you are interested in and why? And then you want to talk about what problems are going out, what specific issues or concerns are going out on in your field that generate this topic as being a problem. So you are generating interest in a specific audience. Not everybody's going to be interested in what you have to say. Also, in addition to you talking about why there's a problem, which you'll do in a number of ways, we'll talk about in just a second, you are putting the problem within the context of the larger body of evidence that already exists. So what literature already is out there, which is why it's good if you've already done some work on your literature review. So as you're stating your research problem, you're first going to identify what difficulties, issues, or current practices exist out in the world that make your research problem interesting. So if you're interested in looking at mental health in the prison population, well, you already know that there's a problem here because there are such exceedingly high rates of mental health diagnoses among prisoners. So that reflects right there a research problem. Now you need to whittle that down. You need to make it a little bit simpler and easier to understand for yourself and for your audience, but that is the beginning of a research problem. Or if you're interested in head trauma, then you want to look at, head trauma is a problem. And if you're interested in couple relationships, then how many combat veterans returning home with head trauma are going into intimate relationships, and what's the relationship between that specific phenomenon of head trauma and the outcome for couple relationships. So leading questions as you're stating your research problem is basically, why is this study important? What are the problems that influence the need to do the study? So that is one of the difficult questions to answer, because most people want to say, well, little evidence exists, evidence exists. And I'm okay with you saying that, we need more research, or there's not enough research in. I'm fine with you saying that one, maybe 2 times, but that's it. That's your limit. No more than 2 times. Because you also need to be answering the question of why your problem is important to study by understanding how it's going to impact your field. So if you're interested, again, in head trauma and couples, you want to, the research problem could be, it's important because we need a better understanding of how to treat couples where one person has experienced a head trauma. Or we need to have better information on therapeutic interventions for couples in which one person has experienced a head trauma. So how is it going to impact your field? Not just there's not enough research on this topic. While you're doing this, one of the things that's very common when you're writing proposals is to see long quotations, or even, I don't even like to see any block text in proposals. So try to avoid that, or just avoid it. I really don't even want to see it, because it reflects a lack of critical thought and on your part. That if you look at the APA guide, what they say about block text is that the only reason they even have a need for it is because a lot of times, or the only reason they even format it is because in hard science texts, sometimes you can't summarize literature. You have to put it in as is. But for your purposes and social sciences, there's really not ever a need to quote large blocks of texts unless you're just trying to take up page space. And I don't want you doing that. So if ever you find something from a journal article that's really important, then summarize it. Don't block text it. Also, you want to look at part of the thing you're doing in a proposal or in an introduction, excuse me. Remember, your introduction is just one part of your proposal. One of the things that you're doing within an introduction is going from the very general to the very specific. You're just doing it very fast. So whatever your topic is, you want to identify a broad scope of it. So if you're interested in head trauma, then how many combat veterans coming home are affected by head trauma? That would be the very general. Then if you're going to the more specific, how many of those people who experience head trauma are married or are in intimate relationships? More specific. How many, if you can find, now the more specific you get, the less you're able to find statistics. So you may not be able to find really wide statistics on your specific topic, but you always want to go from the general to the specific, because you remember you're strengthening the purpose of your problem, and that indicates why the problem is important. So in addition to talking about broad specific statistics and talking about the phenomena that you're studying, in this case head trauma and couple relationships, you also want to place your problem within what's already been studied. So maybe you'll find aspects of your topic that you're interested in. For example, using our example of head trauma, you might find studies that point to how head trauma impacts divorce, or how head trauma is related to relationship instability. But you, being a good researcher, want to go more sophisticated, more in depth, want to understand the specific aspects of risk when it comes to head trauma and intimacy. So, for example, the impact of a specific type of head trauma, I'm not familiar with them, on, let's say, sexual satisfaction, or the impact of head trauma on intimate communication, things like that. So, but there was probably already literature that talks broadly about your topic. You want to identify those, because the one way to really make your proposal look good is by showing that you've done your due diligence when it comes to the literature. Now, your introduction is a snapshot, so you do not need to throw a million citations in your introduction. I only want 2 to 3, depending on how many things you're talking about. So your literature review will show that you have done your expansive work on your topic. But for the purpose of your introduction, you want to identify the really important studies you have found to help add context to your study. So the purpose is to remember you're gripping the audience. You're not demonstrating your intelligence yet, in the sense that you've done your research. In the introduction, all you're doing is trying to grab the audience. So enough studies to do that, 2 to 3. That's all you need. And the other reason you're doing that is because you're distinguishing your own study from the other studies that have already existed. You also want to identify your target audience. Who is it going to help? In this case, combat veterans or athletes or whomever it might be. This is an example. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but generally it talks about how it starts. If you look at that first sentence, it talks about findings in neuroscience and sexual socialization. Well, that's a really huge body of literature, but very quickly the authors go from the big neuroscience and sexual socialization to the very specific. If you look at the last sentence, it talks about, or the second to last, it talks about identifying factors that contribute to female sexual health. And even goes on to say they're creating a developmental theory of sexual health. And they only have, look at that, 3 citations in there. So come back and refer to this as you're looking at how to craft your own introduction. Now, the purpose statement is important because it conveys the overall goals of the study. Remember, the problem is you're saying, here's what I'm interested in studying. Here's why. Here's what other authors have said. The purpose statement then goes from that step to, okay, so here's what I want to do, and here's how I'm going to do it. So you identify your goals, and you are leading into your research questions. Now, if you're doing qualitative and quantitative introductions, do this in different ways. So with qualitative purpose statements, you're not going to be, remember if you look back at the different frameworks, in qualitative purpose statements are going to reflect a more tentative approach to the purpose statement. So you're focusing more on lived experiences, and your role is to understand, to explore, to develop a theory or understand the meaning of. The inquiry is open to a lot of possibilities. And you are a very neutral player in that process. So you want to describe a general working definition of what you're studying. So if we've been talking about our example in quantitative terms, but if you're interested in qualitative research, you could ask the question, what is the general experience of couples in which one partner has experienced a head trauma? That reflects a potential grounded theory qualitative question. So you'll want to include words that link back to your methodology, or that start to link forward to your methodology. So grounded theory, case study, etc. But not to go into too much detail, because that's where your methodology will come in later. We're not talking about that yet. Okay. Here's an example of what this might look like. So refer back to this. This is from our earlier example of female sexual health. And if you're interested in qualitative literature, this is a good example to look like when you're looking at a purpose statement. In quantitative purpose statements, you're more direct, more close-ended, I guess, and you're using words like the purpose of the study, the intent, our objective, our desired outcome is of the study to do this, or this. Whereas in qualitative research, it's more open. We want to discover this. This is more, here's our objective, and we want this goal by the end of the time we're done. So obviously, one of the most important things is to identify your variables. In this case, head trauma and intimacy. Head trauma being your independent and intimacy being your dependent variables. You want to use words that connect the variables together, the correlation between, the relationship between, the comparison of variables, etc. Independent variables always go first, and you want to mention specific methodology, such like a regression analysis or a meta-analysis, and that can be a little bit more. I would refer back to our last lecture to understand that a little bit better, or which methodologies you want to use. Okay, so here's an example of a quantitative purpose statement, and there's not even a single reference in this statement. Remember that the depth of your knowledge of the literature should be revealed in the literature review itself, not necessarily in the purpose statement or in the introduction at all. You just need enough to capture the audience and to make a case for your study. The research questions are the focal point of the entire proposal. So they come on early, but they are the culmination of both of your purpose statement, and then they set the stage for the rest, the literature review and the methodology. And depending on what type of research you're doing, will situate your questions. So qualitative research questions are necessarily broad. You're interested in exploration, not necessarily to seek a causal, or not at all to seek a causal relationship. You're also interested in understanding processes. So how does something happen or occur? Here's a couple of examples of some qualitative research questions. How does one thing happen? Or what's the experience of? How and what? Those are the two big leads into qualitative research questions. These will be at the end of you should have your research questions at the end of your introduction. In quantitative research questions, however, are about relationships between variables. So in your research questions, and what's important to know the difference between quantitative and qualitative is qualitative asks about experiences, whereas it says open-ended, not making any hypotheses. You're just asking open-ended experiential type of questions. Quantitative questions, however, are going to reveal hypotheses that you have about the study that you've done, or are going to do in your case. So you are making predictions, you're just putting them in question form. So there's basically two types of hypotheses. The null hypothesis, which reflects no relationship, and this is usually not what you want to find, because if, let's say, for example, use our example of head trauma and intimacy. If you have an interest in that topic, then your hypothesis will be that head trauma is positively or is negatively correlated with intimacy. In other words, head trauma is harmful to couples' intimacy. That would be the alternative hypothesis. So the purpose of this is kind of a weird concept to understand with quantitative research. I don't know why they do it this way, but it reflects a bias about quantitative research that you can't ever. There's always other possibilities out there. So the purpose of a quantitative study is to get rid of the null hypothesis, which says that there's no relationship between these two things. If in your research you find that there really is no relationship, then you are confirming the null hypothesis of your study. If, however, you do find that there is a relationship, then you have confirmed an alternative hypothesis. And that's not alternative to your question, it's alternative to the null hypothesis. I don't want you to worry too much about this. What I want you to understand is that in quantitative research, the questions that you come up with are intended to get at the relationships between variables. So the impact, if you have a hypothesis that head trauma will be positively correlated with or negatively correlated with intimacy, then your questions can be, here, let's go into some examples. Here's your hypotheses. Differentiation of self will have a significant positive correlation with sexual satisfaction. So for head trauma will be significantly negatively correlated with intimacy. In other words, couples in which one person experiences a head trauma will have diminished intimacy as compared to those couples that don't. These are your examples of a hypothesis. So to make this easier, for the purpose of your proposal, what I want you to do is if you are doing a quantitative study, I don't want you to worry about research questions. I just want you to write hypotheses. If you're doing a qualitative study, I want you to write research questions, because in qualitative studies, you don't have hypotheses. It's just open-ended questions. So don't worry about writing research questions if you're doing a quantitative study. Just write your hypotheses, because that's the purpose of your study. Okay, remember, as always, because of the nature of this class, I don't have time to go through the real specifics with you. I really rely on you doing your reading and communicating with me when you have questions. So this lecture didn't get to all aspects of what you need to do. I will answer any questions that you have, and I'll be happy to consult with each one of you if you need help crafting your proposal. Remember to go in and get a new copy of the get a new copy of the course schedule, because it reflects the new requirements that I have of you. And email me if you have any questions.